Good day, Steve. How you doing down there?
I'm actually up here. I'm actually in Amsterdam, about an hour's time difference away from you.
Oh, right. I'm so used to you being at the other side of the world, either in Australia or Bangkok. But great to have you on, and thanks very much for giving some time to talk to the Mint.
Well, it's good to be back into the throw again. I was taken out of it by the election campaign and all the living in Thailand rather than Europe. So hopefully I'll be more engaged in future.
Well, great to have you back in the fray.
Mm.
You mentioned the Australian election, and I thought it'd be good to just get your take on what happened and what its significance is.
Well, I mean, the overwhelmingly good thing is that a leader that virtually everybody loathed, including a large number of people in his own party, tried a divide and conquer electoral campaign where he deliberately provoked the 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 gay and transsexual community by putting up an anti-transsexual candidate in a conservative seat, expecting to lose the seat because of it, but to win votes from what he saw as redneck voters in the western suburbs, and it failed completely. He lost both the western suburbs and the seat that he put the anti-trans candidate into. And in effect, his party has lost about half its seats in Parliament. The overall Liberal National Coalition didn't fall as much because no national party lost their seat. They're the country party members effectively in the country in Australia. But all the urban ones who are Liberal, half of them lost their seats. So it was a disastrously bad campaign, and we've gone from somebody with no charisma and no empathy to somebody with not much charisma but a lot of empathy, and that's Anthony Albanese. And one of his very first acts as Prime Minister was to put an Aboriginal flag on the stage behind him when he spoke, which is a sign of the change in the orientation of the country that's come with the change from the Conservatives, misnamed Liberals, to the Labor Party. And they're now, because they're looking aside, and nothing has been done apart from grandstanding and press releases in the previous 9 years of the Liberal Party government. So they're finding an absolute mess. So many acts have been passed and nothing has been done about them. Legislation hasn't been brought forward and so on. So they've got a huge cleaning act to do after the Conservatives have been there and literally, certainly for the last 3 years, done nothing worth speaking of.
So just before we get on to the challenges the new government faces, I just wonder about the sort of parallels. Here we had a prime minister, Liberal prime minister, who was a sort of could be said to be a slight Trumpian figure who
Oh
tried
yeah,
to play,
Trump without the hairdo and the personality.
but he didn't manage to keep control, and he split, and the more sort of middle of the road lost out, I suppose. And compare that to obviously the Republicans, where Trump seems to be still in control, and the centre is keeping with Trump. I mean, how do you see Australia difference? Do you think that's a sign of where the Republicans could go, or just that Australia actually is just not like America?
Oh, it's Australia's not like America. We haven't got the religious lunatics dominating politics and in Australia. Anything America is just we've got to realize how weird the country is in terms of its religious component compared to any other Anglo-Saxon nation and virtually any other Western nation. You can't find the same emphasis upon the church and religion and different factions of God believers in any country apart from America. So the term fundamentalism actually originated to describe the so-called reform elements of the American churches. So that fundamentalism doesn't exist elsewhere. But what actually, nonetheless, Morrison, the ex-prime minister, was a religious fundamentalist. He belonged to a Pentecostal religious sect. And the only reason, when you look at the proportion of people who are putting themselves as religious in Australia, more than half the country, when they're asked at the census, said they're agnostic or atheist. And
Right.
then the fraction that belongs to one of these extreme religious groups, like the Pentecostals, is of the order of 1% of the population. But with the way in which candidates are chosen, for every election, you have to have candidates standing for re-election to be the party's representative in their own seat, unlike the crazy UK system when somebody gets in there until they die or or lose the vote. So, but every 3 years, therefore, there's an internal vote, and if you have a 1% of the population in an electorate of 100,000 people, that's that's 1,000 people can turn up from your church, and therefore with that scale, if you have a dedicated campaign in that church to select the local member for a Conservative party, you will get in. So it's one of the dangers of it. You have to be careful when you design a system where the party members vote for the candidates, because if you do it at the electorate level, then that means that a tiny minority in the overall country can overwhelm the number of people in that electorate who are themselves willing to go and get involved in politics. So 1% of the population, 100,000 people, 1,000 potential voters to select candidates, you could literally have them take over every seat in the country, even though they're only 1% of the population. It didn't get that bad in Australia. I think we've got about 4 people from Pentecostal religions in the Morrison cabinet, I think, let alone the government. So
Right.
what you had, and of course, when it happens in the Republicans, rather than 1% of the population being religious junkies, it must be of the order of 20% at least. So it's quite possible for the Republican Party to be dominated by religious nut jobs. Pardon me being rude about this, but I'm quite happy to be rude about extreme beliefs in Christianity, and therefore you've lost the party permanently.
So what about, do you think more parallels with the UK? And we've got obviously a Labour opposition that it doesn't currently have a lot of policies, and I don't think the Labour opposition in Australia had many policies either, tried to keep a low profile. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that's what happened in the previous election. And the reason why people were so scarred by Morrison winning back in 2019 was that we had a very comprehensive set of policies put together by Bill Shorten, who was the leader of the Labor Party at that time. And one of them involved changes to a tax concession for older voters with an offset tax system, which they were going to reform. And that was used as a scare campaign to get the older voters to vote against them and for the Conservatives. So your very, very detailed set of policies was seen as losing the election. So this time round, Albanese basically had to just say, go along with the government on a huge range of things, including stuff that the left was abhorred, battening down on refugees, really terrible terms for migrants, etc., etc. And now that's being rolled back. So they didn't want them to be targeted by Morrison on a whole range of issues where he could have done a divide and conquer approach. So they did take a low profile. But the person in charge is someone who nobody would argue is a Keir Starmer. Okay. So you have somebody who doesn't have a great deal of charisma. This is the new leader, Anthony Albanese. He wasn't a big personality like a Gough Whitlam or a Ben or Galloway, that sort of personality. But he's a very decent human being. That's always been accepted, and that's rare in politics, as you'd be aware. And his background: he was born to a single mother and raised in council flat. So his identity is with the poor and the working class in that sense, rather than the top end of the world. So a small target with somebody like that is probably more successful than a small target with somebody like Keir Starmer.
Well, Starmer is from a working class background.
Oh, he is. Oh, my apologies. I didn't realise that. That's good to know. He doesn't look it.
He doesn't look it.
Okay. My apologies. I'm wrong.
I think his father was a railway worker, I think, if I
Okay.
remember right. And he does, I suppose he presents himself as sort of decent. He's trying to actually challenge the fact he's boring, but other people are saying boring is good. We need more boring now. We've had enough excitement with the likes.
I'm just annoyed by the extent to which you've been shafting Jeremy Corbyn all the way through. That there was no internal shafting in the Labor Party when Albanese won. There was no shafting of a left wing alternative. In fact, in that sense, Albanese would be regarded as more on the left, closer to the left than Bill Shorten was. So we didn't go from a very charismatic left figure like Corbyn to a less charismatic centre-right candidate like Keir Starmer's. We went from a centre-right with not a great deal of charisma, but some solid presence, to somebody who's also sort of centre-left, I'd imagine you'd say Albanese is. So it doesn't have the same unfortunate baggage as the change in the leadership of the British Labour Party.
But will he lack a sort of mandate because he hasn't come in with a set of things he's going to do, a vision, a sort of direction?
Mandate's the sort of the term that the other party uses when they lose. And that's what's happening right now. They're saying, you only 38% of the population voted for the Labor Party, which is a caricature of Australia's proportional voting system, which means you put the party you want to vote for first, and then your second and third and fourth preferences. So 38% of people gave Labor Party first preference, but of the order of 12% gave Green their first preference and Labor second. So if you actually had a two-party system with the Australian electorate, the vote wouldn't have been 38% in favour of the Labor Party. It would have been 52, 53%, and 47% for the Conservatives. And of course, as you know, that's a relatively small margin. It translates into a landslide in the number of electoral seats won.
So you think they can actually develop direction and policies, etc., and get them through without that election platform?
Oh, they've once you're in power, you can make up your own. You make up your own platform. We know roughly what they intend doing, but see, a lot of this involves one of the weaknesses of any political system when private money can dominate who gets election funding, and this is the great tragedy of our electoral systems. We let the private sector decide the funding. Well, that meant for the Conservatives, they were beholden to the coal companies, and for the Labor Party, they were beholden to the coal unions. So therefore, coal wins. And I think some ridiculous number of fossil fuel projects have been approved by both parties. Something like close, I think it must be about 100 new coal mines or gas strikes and so on have been approved. And that's the problem, because you in this current environment, literally environment, you want us to be shutting down fossil fuel ventures, not opening up new ones. So that's the negative side.
You don't think the new Labour government is going to be radical from climate change?
Not on that front until they're forced to, and that's a great weakness. The Labor Party will do, for the sake of the trade unions in the fossil fuel sector, what the Conservatives are doing for the sake of the fossil fuel companies.
What about the concept of a just transition? I mean, in the US. I believe they're trying to work with the unions because they have similar obviously issues. I think everywhere, obviously, some people are going to
that'll be the background text of what they're doing. So you'll find they'll be establishing solar power plants and wind generation systems and battery systems in the regions that are currently the fossil fuel mining areas. But it'll be a slowly process. And I tend to see trends before most people, and they take longer to break than I expect. But that caveat aside, I think we're going to see such drama on the climate front that at some point our hand is going to be forced. We're going to be saying we simply can't allow any further use of coal or oil. Coal certainly first off for power, and that is likely to happen, I think, in the next 10 years. And so I think the softly approach is still thinking we've got till 2050 to bring our carbon emissions to zero, and I think that's wishful thinking.
And do you think the people who voted Teal voted the sort of blue-green on a sort of climate change agenda? Are they going to have any influence? Is that?
That's one of the reasons the UK should, if you want to do something decent in the UK, campaign to copy the Australian or New Zealand electoral systems, because we have, and it's also a similar system, of course, on the continent. There is proportional representation in a lot of seats. There's one system called the Hare-Clark system, which applies in both Tasmania and the Australian Capital Territory, where the House of Representatives seats have multiple candidates. So each House of Reps, rather than being, say, 100,000 and one person elected, you have, say, 500,000 and 5 people elected. And then if you have a 60-40 break and progressive to the Conservative, you get 3 progressive and 2 Conservative candidates representing that larger electorate. And that is a very sensible way to go. You actually get much more meaningful democracy than you get in the UK or the USA.
But the Labour government still has a majority, doesn't it? So it can rule without the need for support.
It has a majority, but I think it's a majority of 1. And in the Senate, they're a minority. So to get legislation passed, they have to negotiate with both the Greens and the Teals. And I think they're aware that they have to they have to include everybody on the progressive side of politics in decision making in the House of Reps now, in a way that wasn't necessary for the previous government or the government before that.
Okay, so let's now look at the challenges the government face, because for all it sort of, if it has a progressive agenda, it's facing presumably huge financial macroeconomic challenges with inflation growing and so on. So how do you see the situation, the financial situation it's facing?
Oh, that's the usual. With the last election, the 2019 election, I wrote a semi-facetious blog post called "The Hospital Pass Election." In other words, you're about to get dumped by reality. Give the ball to the other side so they can get dumped by reality. Well, I was right about the reality, but the experience of the Conservatives running when we had the enormous bushfires that wiped out a large part of some of the southern and northern states, then floods, then COVID, then more floods. It was appalling having the Conservatives in charge. But look what's happening right now. We have the global outbreak of inflation driven by supply chain problems to begin with. Global warming, even more amplified than 3 years ago. And they are making the mistake, and this is the great problem. They still think about budget deficits in the same way the Conservatives do. So I think they've got to get involved in budget repair. And there are leading economists that influence, like Steve Kukulas, who's the guy that I have absolutely no time for, and he has no time for me. But he's advising Labor it's absolutely necessary to get your deficit down. Now, that's the exact opposite of what they should be doing. So it's possible they'll focus on that and minimise what they should be doing for both global warming and social justice, and also minimising the impact of pretty much unavoidable inflation on working class incomes.
So how would they, if they did what you think they should be doing, what exactly would be, what would you advise them to do?
They'd be running a deficit that would finance us basically subsidising energy consumption by workers, and while trying to keep the minimum wage rising at the same rate of inflation, because what we're seeing in the average wages are rising less than inflation. So the rate of inflation now is about 2 or 3% higher than wage rises. So all this talk of a wage price spiral, if there was a wage price spiral, that is heading back towards zero again, because wage pressures are falling all the way through. What we're really seeing is a breakdown of the production system, simply meaning it costs more for all sorts of reasons, even when it just takes more time for a commodity to be manufactured and shipped to the final buyer from a production system. That involves an increase in cost. So, and what we're seeing is a breakdown of the production system, the global supply chain falling apart. Firstly, driven largely by COVID and the fact that you've never got enough workers on hand. Therefore, you're under capacity, not because you haven't got the demand. The demand is there, but you don't have the workers to man the production lines, and particularly the shipping lines to get the stuff from the factory to the home. And that is causing just a rise in the physical cost of production. And it's a question of which social class cops it. Is it going to be the workers or the capitalists? And
so you can't really do anything about that supply.
Not by putting up the rate of interest, no. Putting up the rate of interest is likely to cause the economy to tank, because it'll push credit demand from positive to negative. And as you and I know, the neoclassicals don't think that matters, because they don't understand the role of credit in aggregate demand. But credit is part of both aggregate demand and income. So if we go from positive credit to negative credit, we're likely to see a large slump in GDP. And that can be driven by the fact that interest rates are rising, from the order of, like, if mortgage rates of the order of 2% in some countries to 5 and 6%, with the level of debt that people have got right now, with the household debt pretty much around the 100% of GDP mark all around the Western world, then suddenly 6% of GDP, not even including working class incomes, but 6% of GDP is going to be going towards servicing that debt. And that will both encourage bankruptcies. People will not be able to maintain their current mortgages, but also an absolute unwillingness to borrow. So we'll see credit turn negative, and that will take demand out of the economy.
And how far do you see parallels with the 70s? Because obviously post 70s, you have this huge change in sort of not just governments, but in government philosophy, rise of Reagan, Thatcher, etc., on the back of the inflation, unemployment, and so on?
Well, just to make one point quite clear here, according to the salespeople for neoliberalism, there would be no problems afterwards. They'd be a painful adjustment period and everything would be so much better. You wouldn't need Social Security because you'd all have well-paying jobs. You could pay for your own health. You wouldn't need to have government provision of health. You could afford your own housing. You wouldn't need
This was the
schemes,
sales
etc.,
pitch
etc.
post the 70s.
Yeah, for the 70s, for the deregulation. Okay.
Yeah.
Higher rate of economic growth would have occurred. Economy would have grown faster. Okay. All utterly bullshit. Everything working class people can't afford. The medical costs have got out of reach, particularly in America. Social Security is lousy for the people at the bottom. The schemes we have, the superannuation schemes and 401ks and things like that, your retirement income is based on your work income, which means if you're a poor person while working, you're going to be a poor person when you can't work anymore. Unemployment has been higher for most of that period, though it's lower right now, and economic growth has been lower in the neoliberal period. So all the advertising wasn't there, and now you've got to pick up the pieces.
So so that was a sales pitch then, and you feel you'd say it's been discredited. What's the new sales pitch? Because presumably people are going to look for someone to save the situation, aren't they? As the crisis worsens.
A major thing about one of the reasons for the dramatic fall in prices, inflation, wasn't just, of course, Volcker's interest rate rise. It was globalization, moving production offshore. That both hit employment in the West, so there were no longer the working class jobs. The skilled labour jobs weren't there anymore. They were transferred to China in particular. But then you had far lower costs coming back. So your job as a security clerk at a retail outlet could enable you to buy some of the goods made in China because they were so much cheaper than they would have been if they were made by you when you used to work as a fitter and turner in an American factory. Well, that's gone. I think we're seeing to see a collapse of globalization. The impact of COVID is only the very first taste of that. But those long supply chains just aren't reliable anymore. And therefore, you're going to get onshoring of production to some extent. So costs are going to rise. And also at the moment, we've got a rising cost because that globalized supply chain is fragile. So all that means basically your cost of production has risen. And then the question is, what's left? There's left room, in other words, for profit and wages. So which one's going to go down? And the likelihood it'll be wages that go down. So what you would need is the state to compensate for that. You need a government which is going to do more social security. If you don't give people the money to pay for energy bills, they freeze to death in Northern Europe, particularly England, which is the world's worst insulation, and they melt in the tropics. So you're going to face an absolute need to provide the capacity to buy that, and it won't be coming out of people's pockets. It'll need to be state provided. So you need larger deficits as part of this to compensate for the extremely low wages, which are not going to rise enough to compensate for the inflation.
But I suppose what happened, I would suggest, in the 70s is that there was a sort of a rise of a new ideology which said the past was a failure, we've got a new solution, we're going to do things differently, therefore bet on us. And I wonder what the narrative is potentially now to say, the past has failed, the ideas were wrong, these are the new ideas, that we're going to promote, back us. Because what you're saying is, it sounds more like there's going to be blood, sweat, and tears, we're going to have to go into debt, things are going to cost more, it's going to be tough. That's not a great sales pitch, is it?
It's a Winston Churchill sales pitch. You're dead right. I can offer you nothing but blood, sweat. Was it nothing? Nothing but blood, sweat, and tears. Was that the actual?
That's right. And the thing is that, but in a war, you might say, okay, but when the war's over, things are going to get better. But it's blood, sweat, and tears, and it's climate change and ecological breakdown, and it's blood, sweat, and tears as far as we can see into the future.
Unfortunately, that's true. And it's only a question of when people realise that you can actually get political acceptance of it. Because the hassle at the moment, if you run on a campaign like that, you'll lose. Because the person promising fairy floss every day is going to win over the person who says we can't afford to floss anymore. And that is the dilemma we face, that we are massively over consuming on this planet. we're about to see the ecology's reaction to the extra energy we've made it absorb, as well as the damage we've done to biodiversity and the breakdown of ecological systems with the chemicals we've pumped into the atmosphere and into the ground and soil and waters. That's all going to come back and bite us, and we have to have a dramatic decline in human consumption levels. What's been called degrowth is necessary, but you can't sell degrowth. Nobody.
But
You have
maybe
one person promising.
people do try and sell a better way of life, don't they? They say that,
Yeah, but
might
it's
be a
such a
simpler,
huge.
but a more connected, a slower, a richer way of life.
Yeah, but there's an enormous physical changes in all of that. So, for example, if you think about our current consumption pattern, it's completely linear. You buy something, you use it, you throw the packaging in the garbage bin, and ultimately the thing you've consumed ends up in the garbage bin as well, whether that's your toilet or the waste dump and the products are thrown out X years into the future when they've been exhausted. It's a totally linear process. And now you can't make it entirely circular, but you have to. So when you buy milk in the future, it'll come, you'll have to bring your own glass bottle to go to a dispensary to pick it up and bring it back yourself. And there will be no, I think we'll just have completely banning disposable packaging. That'll go. There are so many other elements like that.
All these changes that, yes, clearly we need to make. Do you see any chance of some leadership in Australia? I mean, what you're sort of saying is that the government's too in hot to the Labor to really do that.
No,
so
I don't.
Where could that leadership come from?
Well, it can come from the Greens to some extent, and it can come from the Teals, but none of them really have got their heads around the scale of the problem. This is why, like, in doing my work on climate change, that's why I agreed to be a candidate for a failed attempt at a new political party. The party's still continuing on, but it failed to get anywhere at all in any of its election campaigns in this last election. But we had three top-class climate researchers, including myself, advising the party and a range of other highly skilled people as well in other areas. So our group would have been in there saying, look, this is serious. This is not a case of consuming one less pork pie each day and everything's going to be fine. This is a need to have it. If we're going to have a human society, we have to reduce human consumption, and the burden has to fall on the rich as much as it possibly can. We have, I'd be arguing in favour of we have to reduce human population as well. And let's do it by decision making and a slow and having a negative growth process rather than massive deaths from ecological catastrophes. But that message won't be listened to until after the Germans have invaded Poland. In other words, we just like in the Second World War, nobody listened to Winston Churchill until what he was warning would happen did happen. And then you got rid of Chamberlain and got Churchill in charge. That we haven't had that moment yet. And only when we have a moment on that scale where the people saying, oh, we can negotiate our way out of this, you suddenly realize that the climate doesn't negotiate. And once that sinks in and you see what that actually means, then you'll get people saying, well, we have to do something. But at that point, in most political parties around the world, you'll have people who are floundering, who still think that the damages are 20 and 30 years in the future, maybe even 80 years in the future, if you believe neoclassical economists, and tiny. And they're going to find there's the next 2 decades is more likely to be when the really serious stuff starts to hit the fan, and the scale of damage is existential. It's not a couple of % of GDP in the far distant future. It's whether human civilization can survive.
So it has to get worse before there's a chance for the voices such as yourselves to get
which is why I don't apologise for my flying right now, because I want to get this message out in as many places as possible. Because unless we have people who are aware of it, when this starts to happen, we're likely to do the exact opposite of what's necessary. We're likely to have people putting in more power. We've got to have more power. Forget about this catastrophe over there. When we lost that particular country courtesy of a giant storm, that's their problem. We've got to do more domestically. To get the global agreement at national levels to reduce consumption, you need awareness that this is truly existential. This is not something that you can negotiate anymore.
Well, with that somber note, but hope that you will get your message out and make your flights worthwhile. I wish you all the best. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Henry. Bye.